But what we've seen over the last 20, 25 years is that nationalism is not going away as a political force. And so I think it's a sort of half-domesticated animal. If you leave it to its own devices, the worst kinds of people are going to come in. In the United States, they tend to be called Steve, like Steve Bannon and Steve Miller and so on. And they'll prod and they'll bait the nationalist beat until it runs wild, until it's the worst form of itself it can be.
You sort of start off with defining what we think of as democracy, and how democracy as we know it is sort of devolving into illiberal democracy. Can you maybe just talk about what the difference is between that and what you mean when you talk about liberal democracy, small l liberal democracy?
Sure. So, look, I think there's a lot of confusion about what exactly we mean when we talk about democracy, right? A little under 10 years ago, there was a big referendum in Switzerland in which people voted on whether or not it should be legal to build minarets in the country. You know, the sort of tower from which the call to prayer is often done on the side of a mosque. And 62% of Swiss people voted to outlaw the building of minarets in the country. As a result, the Swiss constitution now reads, and I quote, "There's freedom of religion in Switzerland, full stop. The building of minarets is forbidden, full stop." Which doesn't make much sense. Now, a lot of people in response called this undemocratic. A lot of Swiss papers, Canadian papers, American papers said, this is undemocratic. And I think that's sort of a confusion, right? Because if 62% of people vote for this, it's sort of it's strange to say this is not democratic, right? What then does democracy mean? I think we can clear this kind of confusion up by remembering that there's two basic things that our political system tries to accomplish. It's liberal and it's democratic. Now, by liberal, I don't mean liberal and conservative. I don't mean Justin Trudeau versus Mr. Harper or anything like that. I mean a commitment to individual liberty, to the idea that you can say and not say whatever you want, that you can worship in the way you want or not worship, and that'll be respected, that you can be in a relationship with who you want to be in a relationship with. And in order to facilitate that, we need a set of key things. We need the protection of individual rights, but we also need the separation of powers and the rule of law, so that a dictator can't just punish people he doesn't like. So that's one part of it. The other part is democracy, the idea of a rule of the people, which to my mind has to mean that you're actually translating popular views into public policies in some kind of way, that the political system is actually responsive to what people want. And what I argue in the book, one of the things I argue in the book, is that these two things have been starting to come apart for a long time. That for a long time we've had a political system that isn't sufficiently responsive to people, something you might call rights without democracy, and that in part as a result, we now get politicians that are often quite popular, that are democratically elected, or that even pass what they want through referenda, the things that are democratic, but they're not liberal. They violate the rights of minorities, and increasingly they concentrate so much power in their own hands that they undermine the rule of law and the separation of powers.
So why is it that younger generations don't think it's as important to have all of these liberties and freedoms, or it's not as essential to live in democracies like Western democracies that we think of today?
Yeah, so I think it's worth sort of explaining where a lot of my concerns in the book come from. When I was growing up, I assumed, and political scientists assumed, journalists assumed, most citizens assumed, I think, that democracy in certain countries was safe. We always knew that, there were some fledgling democracies, often in poor countries, that might be embattled. Right now, there's a real challenge to Kenyan democracy, and that's tragic. Kenya is a very important country, but it wouldn't have surprised political scientists, because it's not a very affluent country. Democracy had never, in their terms, been consolidated there. But once a country had a GDP per capita of more than about 16,000 Canadian dollars in today's terms, once it had changed government for free and fair elections a couple of times, it was supposedly safe. It was supposedly consolidated. And the way that this was supposed to look was that democracy had become the only game in town, that most people gave this huge importance to democracy, that very few people were open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy, and perhaps most importantly, that there was no major politicians or political parties that really violated some of the very basic rules and norms of how a democratic system was supposed to work. Well, a few years ago, before Donald Trump, before Brexit, before Doug Ford for that matter, for I believe that his brother had already been mayor somewhere in the world, we started to look at that with a colleague. We started to look at, is that actually still the case? And what we found was pretty shocking. We saw that actually, when you look at the United States, for example, over 2/3 of older Americans born in the 1930s and 1940s say it's essential to them to live in a democracy. Less than 1/3 of younger Americans born since 1980 do. 20 years ago, 1 in 16 Americans said that army rule was a good system of government. Now 1 in 6 do. And among young and affluent people in the United States, it actually went from 6% to 35%, nearly a 6-fold increase. Now, perhaps sitting in Toronto, you might be tempted to say, well, that's just for people who are south of the border, you know, they're sort of a little strange. But this is actually something that's going on in a lot of countries. There's a lot of European countries in which the number of people who like the idea of a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections has gone up a lot over the last 20 years. So the question is, why is it that this has changed so much over time, and why is it that young people are particularly prone to that? Well, I think there's a few reasons for that. One is that young people don't understand the threat of non-democratic systems in the same way. If you were born in the 1930s and 1940s, you have some life understanding of a threat that fascism poses. And you have some life understanding of a threat that communism posed throughout the Cold War, of how horrible life was for people in the Soviet Union. I think for a lot of young people, that's not the case anymore. They look at the political system that they have today and they say, look, there's lots of things wrong with it. There's all kinds of problems. So perhaps this isn't working so well. Perhaps we should try something new. How bad could things get? And they don't have a life understanding of how bad things could get.
That being said, what makes someone want to vote for an authoritarian, strong leader, someone who's going to make them feel secure and safe and have a better future outlook and make a better life for their children? Why is that promise? I mean, I know why the promise is appealing, but why does a leader like that appeal to voters who might be feeling insecure or alienated?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's two questions here, right? One question is, what is the nature of the appeal? And the other question is, why is it that appeals now rather than in the past, right? So let me answer both of those. I mean, the nature of the appeal is always the same, right? And this word populist is used all of the time, and nobody quite knows what it means. And I was sort of tempted to say, let's just never use the term because it's too confusing. But I think there is actually a core to it which makes sense, right? So why do we call Doug Ford a populist? Why do we call Donald Trump a populist? Why do we call Recep Erdogan a populist? Why do we call Viktor Orban a populist? Why do we call somebody like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela a populist? They don't seem to have much in common, right? You may have noticed that the current president of the United States is not overly fond of Muslims. When you look at Recep Erdogan, the president of Turkey, he doesn't appear to be overly fond of anybody who's not a Muslim. So they don't have that in common, right? There are some populists who are very right-wing on the economy, who say the real problem is the tax is too high, and we're spending too much on poor people, and let's slash the welfare state. There are other people who are actually very left-wing economically, and who are saying we need to spend a lot more on the welfare state and so on. So what do they have in common? Well, one thing, which is the claim that politics at its heart is really simple, that the only reason why you have political problems is that the elite is corrupt and self-serving, and that it cares more about special interests or outsiders or minorities you don't like than it does about, quote-unquote, people like you and me. and that I, the populist, have a unique ability to embody common sense in the real people. I am your voice, Donald Trump said at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, Ohio in 2016. I alone can fix it. Once I'm in office, everything is going to be better. Well, once they're in office, it doesn't quite turn out to be like that, does it? People suddenly say, who knew that things could be so complicated? Who knew that healthcare could be so complicated? I have a suspicion that you might read in a tweet in a couple of weeks or months, who knew that negotiating with Kim Jong-un might turn out to be complicated? But of course, they don't actually want to admit that they have sort of failed to deliver on their promises and that is their own fault. So what do populists do in the next step? They start to blame. They start to blame the media for telling lies and propaganda and fake news, and they need to be regulated and brought to heel. They start to blame the opposition, whom they don't recognize as legitimate political adversaries, but they think of them as illegitimate enemies. And so they call them traitors, terrorists. And they start to blame independent institutions, whether it's courts, whether it's institutions like the FBI or the Department of Justice, who are enemies of the American people, right? Or the Turkish people, or the Hungarian people. It's the same rhetoric. So that's the nature of the populist appeal. And it is surprisingly consistent across contexts, and it's dangerous in very similar ways. But that leaves open the question of why is this happening?
I guess why do we sort of go from populism, which I think is sort of supposed to reflect popular will, and if the majority of people are feeling this way, then why not? But how do we sort of go from populism to authoritarian or militaristic rule? Is that a slippery slope, and how does that happen?
Yeah, I think you can see it in the set of steps that I've described, right? So Jan Werner Müller, a scholar I think very helpfully, says that populism is the exclusive claim to the moral representation of the people. That's a bit of a mouthful, but what he means by that is that I alone represent the people, and anybody who disagrees with me thereby is illegitimate. That is the crucial thing about populism. Now, once you claim that, you can't say, hey, you know what? I disagree with what the opposition party does, but if they have the votes to block a certain legislative proposal, that's fine. That's a normal part of politics. You can't say, hey, I disagree with the way that the court ruled on this particular thing, but that's fine. That's a normal part of politics. Instead, you start to undermine those institutions. Look at somebody like Viktor Orban in Hungary. There's elections very soon in Hungary. Somebody who was elected in 2011, who immediately started to say the judiciary is really inefficient. Court cases take too long and so on, so I'm going to reform it. And he took political control of the judiciary. He said, well, the state media, they're telling too many lies, so we really need to change who is allowed on television, the state media. Well, now it's become a pure propaganda outlet for the government. He started to say, hey, you know what, let's put a little bit of pressure on the private media companies so that they can't be too critical of the government. They are now essentially owned by Orban's friends and colleagues. And he took control of the Electoral Commission. So that in the last months, the Electoral Commission investigated every opposition party in the country and fined them the total sum of electoral funding they had gotten. But miraculously, it neglected to investigate Fidesz, the party of a ruling prime minister. So we now have elections in the heart of the European Union, in a country which political scientists had said had achieved a consolidated democracy just a few years ago, which are neither free nor fair. And we see precisely the moment in which a democratically elected prime minister is no longer able to be dislodged by democratic means. And that's an important thing to note. Look, when I ask you to think about think of one case in which democracy spectacularly collapsed, what are you thinking about? Well, I'm going to take a guess. I think you're thinking about Berlin in 1933. That's a dangerous comparison, not just because all stupid arguments start with Hitler, but but because it's meant to be alarmist, but it's actually the opposite. If you think that the way that democracies perish is, people doing Hitler salutes in the streets and having big shiny black boots and running around with torches, then you're going to look outside today and say, well, none of this is happening, so we're fine. But that's not how democracies go to die. Hungary is how democracies go to die.
I had talked to, I guess, a behavioral scientist about why a populist leader would appeal to, an average voter in Ontario, and they suggested that those sentiments, xenophobic, economic stress, us versus them, those feelings need to be nurtured, and those messages need to sort of be roused, right? And so how does that happen today? And I guess I'm asking specifically about social media. Is that sort of making it easier to give rise and to empower, anti-system fringe political movements like populism?
So I think what's absolutely clear is that the sort of ugliest sentiments that come out in populism need to be nurtured by a capable political entrepreneur, right? Who preys on them and so on. But, sometimes people in each country become so obsessed with their particular populist that they think it's all about the fact that this guy, or sometimes gal, but rarely, suddenly appeared on the political scene, right? They say, well, it's just Trump, was famous and he had this platform and this and that, and that's why we have it now, right? But it's a funny coincidence, isn't it, that these people just appeared in all of these different countries at the same time, right? So I don't think it's about them. I think it's about things that are deeper than that make it possible for somebody like Trump to exploit a set of longer-term developments in a way that Huey Long tried to do in the middle of the 20th century, but couldn't ride all the way to the presidency, because they weren't as strong, they weren't as deeply rooted. So if you allow me the slight excursion, I'm going to tell a story about a chicken to explain all of this.
Great.
Now, this is the kind of chicken that, if I'm allowed to make a couple of presumptions about the audience here, you'd all like to eat for dinner, which is to say that it's local and organic and free range and those kinds of things. And all the other animals on the farm, tell it, hey, be careful, the farmer only seems nice, but one day he's going to come and kill you. And the chicken says, what are you talking about? Every day the farmer comes and feeds me, and he mutters some encouraging words. Why would things suddenly be so different? Well, Bertrand Russell, who I'm stealing the story from, the British philosopher, in his nice wry wit says that one day the farmer does come to wring the chicken's neck, showing that more sophisticated views as to the uniformity of causation would have been to the chicken's benefit. What does he mean by that? What he means is that there's scope conditions to how things work in the social world, right? So as long as the chicken was too thin to fetch a good price on the market, he had a reason to keep feeding it. Once it was fat enough to fetch a good price, he was always going to slaughter it. I think we should think about the scope conditions of democratic stability. Why is it that democracies around the world, at least in countries that are relatively affluent and so on, were so stable for 50, 60 years after World War II, in some countries even longer than that, and now they're starting to be so unstable? And I think there's three big structural reasons. And social media is one, but I think the other two are in some ways more important. So the first is just a stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens. In most countries, the living standard of people doubled generation after generation for most of the period of democratic stability. And now, it's flat, or at best slightly increasing. And that makes a real difference in how people think about politics. Look, when you go back to 1970, I don't think that people in Toronto looked at Ottawa and said, I love the capital and everybody who's there is wonderful and the average MP is a paragon of moral virtue. People always had their skepticism towards their political leaders. But in the end they said, you know what, I'm twice as rich as my parents were, my kids are probably going to be twice as rich as me, let's give them the benefit of a doubt. they seem to be sticking to their end of the deal. Now they say, you know what? I've worked really hard all my life, and I don't have much to show for it. My kids are probably going to be worse off than me. Am I allowed to swear in this space? Would it be a great affront against Canadian politeness to swear? I'm going to go and do it. It's going to be very disappointingly mild now, actually. I've worked really hard all my life. I don't have much to show for it. My kids can do worse than me. Let's throw some shit against the wall and see what sticks. How bad could things get, right? And that's a really, really strong impulse, I think. The second thing is sometimes portrayed to be in conflict with this. There's been this big debate over the last year. Is it about the economy, or is it about culture and racism and immigration and all of those things? Look, anything interesting that's ever happened in your life has had more than one cause, hasn't it? If somebody's fallen in love with you, it's probably for more than one reason, I hope. And if somebody's left you, it's probably for more than one reason as well. So in the same way, the two things actually go together. Now, in most democracies, they were founded as mono-ethnic, monocultural countries. Or at least they had a self-conception as being mono-ethnic, monocultural. When you go back to Europe and you ask people in 1960, what makes a true Italian, a true Swede, a true Greek? They would have said, well, somebody who descends ethnically from the same stock as I. And somebody who's brown or black, somebody who's Jewish or Muslim or Hindu, they don't belong, right? Now, thankfully, that has changed. We've had decades of immigration in those countries, and it has actually liberalized the legal conception of who gets to be a citizen and the social conception as well. But it shouldn't surprise us that some people are angry about that, because they had lots of advantages from the old system. If you're not the richest guy, you're not the best educated guy, you perhaps don't have the most social respect in your society. It's really tempting to say, well, at least I'm Italian and not one of those foreigners, right? Or at least I'm part of a majority group and not one of those immigrants. You get something from that. You get a kind of status. Well, now the politician who represents you in parliament might be an immigrant or a child of immigrants. Your boss might be an immigrant or a child of immigrants. That's something we should celebrate, but it shouldn't surprise us that some people will rebel against that. Now, Canada and the United States in this are sort of both similar and different. They're different in that they've always been multi-ethnic societies. They've always been countries of immigration. But they're similar in that there's always been a strict racial hierarchy that gave big advantages to some people over others. Let's not forget how far we've come in overcoming that. I think there's no doubt that it's better to be a member of an ethnic, a religious, a sexual minority in Canada, and even in the United States today, than it was 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. So we've made tremendous progress. But again, there are people who have something to lose from that, who have some of their privileges taken away. And it shouldn't surprise us that they're rebelling against that. All right, social media. The thing that really makes the social media development important is that there are these two things going on beforehand. That people are already frustrated about the pocketbooks and feeling like the system isn't delivering for them. That they already have the impression that, hey, perhaps something is changing and I'm a little worried about some of that cultural transformation. And now you add social media, which makes it far easier for people to circumvent social gatekeepers. So whereas 25 years ago, the owners of a bunch of newspapers and television stations and radio stations could decide who gets a platform, and sometimes they shut up important voices that are marginalized, but sometimes they shut up racists and people who wanted to spread fake news. That's no longer possible, because everybody can put up their website and anybody can come to it. Everybody can spread opinions on social media, and if they appeal to a bunch of people, they get spread really, really quickly, right? And that's great in some contexts, because it allows, think of the admirable kids in Florida who are standing up for gun control because their classmates were murdered. They would never have the platform they have today if it weren't for social media, right? But at the same time, it obviously makes it easier for people who are racist, for people who want to spread fake news and so on, to have a real voice in the national conversation. And when you add that to the frustration about the economy and the fears about cultural change, the three things together become a very dangerous cocktail.
So I guess with this whole Cambridge Analytica scandal, did it work? Were they sort of just capitalizing and stirring up certain feelings and targeting people and potentially influencing how they'll vote at the ballot box? Or were those feelings like sort of already there, or did they create them, I guess? Like what came first?
So as a kind of New Year's resolution, I started this Twitter thread, which keeps growing longer every couple of weeks, of controversies that really aren't controversies, or debates that really aren't debates, right? Ways in which we think it's either this or it's that, when really it can be both at the same time. And I think there's this really strange debate going on where sort of one half of people are saying, Russia influenced the election, Cambridge Analytica influenced the election, that's really what it's all about. And the other half of people are saying, no, you just want to explain away what happened, you might be a shill for Hillary Clinton or something like that. So it's really nothing to do with those things, it's because Hillary was a terrible candidate and we have to, That's not an either or, right? I think it may be that the obviously illicit influence that Russia has had on the election, and the obviously illicit influence that Cambridge Analytica and some of the illegal activities that they were clearly up to have had on the election, swung the election. In the end, Donald Trump won by 80,000 votes spread among 3 states. It's perfectly possible that he would not have gotten those 80,000 votes if it hadn't been for that influence. But you know what? If that was the case, he would still have gotten really, really close to winning the election.
Right.
And in a functioning political system that doesn't have some of the deep challenges that I've outlined, somebody like Donald Trump does not get within striking distance of a presidency, right? So you can both think that Russia has had a terrible influence on the election and that you need very urgent reforms to ensure that that doesn't happen again in the midterms and it doesn't happen in 2020. You can both think that clearly Cambridge Analytica was up to no good and that Facebook was frankly complicit in it, and that you need to have big reforms to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And at the same time recognize that the drivers of populism are much more long-term and much more structural, and that just dealing with those things is not going to save our political system.
Let's talk about Doug Ford. I don't know how closely you're following Ontario politics.
I try not to follow too much about Doug Ford.
Based on what you know, and I guess even Rob Ford, the Ford family, would you consider them populist / authoritarian? Like, how would you classify them as politicians and their political approach, and who might they appeal to?
So, I don't know that I want to make a judgment about how populist they are, because I'm not sure that I quite know enough about that, but I think that there's a whole bunch of very interesting things that come out of this, right? The first one is that wherever I go in the world, and you should all be proud of yourselves, wherever I go in the world, in Germany, in Sweden, in the United States, a question that I get at every event I do is, but aren't there some countries where the populists really aren't making inroads? What about Canada? Doug Ford. So I think it does show that no country is immune from that, right? And there's other examples of that. 10 years ago, Sweden looked like a great case where this wasn't happening. Now the Sweden Democrats, who actually have roots in the neo-Nazi movement, are the second strongest party in a lot of polls in Sweden, right? So nowhere is safe from that. And I think you all know that at this point, but people in other countries don't, so you should feel flattered. The second thing I would say is that there is this slightly naive hope that many people have that you can beat populism by beating and exposing a particular populist, right? So in the United States, a lot of people are saying, look, Donald Trump is this unique threat, but he's a phony, and he's not really delivering for his people. And eventually, people will realize that. And once they do, he's going to go down to terrible defeat in 2020, and everything will be good. Now, look, I think it's quite possible that he goes down to ignominious defeat in 2020. And that's partially because there is a kind of populist playbook there's an illiberal international, and people have become very sophisticated at how to do this. But if it was a populist Olympics, Donald Trump, let's put it politely, would not be close to medal rank. He's not very good at it. So I think he might well lose. But the idea that if Donald Trump loses in 2020, that's the end of that kind of danger to American politics, and it's not going to come back, is absolutely naive. And we've seen it in lots of countries. In Italy, a man by the name of Silvio Berlusconi, who has similarities both to Doug Ford and to Donald Trump, dominated politics for 2 decades. By 2011, Italians were sick of him. He had a terrible economic record. He had all of these scandals. And when there was rumors that he might be, resigning, thousands of people came into the streets of Rome to celebrate. There was this great amateur orchestra and choir that assembled in the span of half an hour, I have no idea how they did it, to sing Handel's Hallelujah. You can watch it on YouTube, it's beautiful. But 7 years later, we had elections a couple months ago, Silvio Berlusconi is back. He's the kingmaker in Italian politics again. And you know what? He's the least scary of the populists in Italy now. Because the far-right League Party, which is truly terrifying, and 5 Stars has even more of a vote. 2/3 of people, nearly 2/3 of people voted for a populist movement in Italy, right? So I think you can see Doug Ford in a similar kind of vein, right? I mean, the Rob Ford experiment ended as it did. And people thought, well, that's that. And now it looks like Doug Ford has a very good chance of being the next Premier of Ontario, right? So it sticks with you. The third thing that it shows to me that's of relevance beyond Canada is that there's a certain idea that, populism is the last attempt of a dwindling ethnic majority to sort of have their way. And that as countries become more diverse, you just can no longer assemble the majority you need for populists. In the United States, it's often called the idea of the inevitable demographic majority. But eventually, sort of nice, tolerant, liberal Democrats are just always going to win because a majority of the population is going to be made up by minorities. Well, Doug Ford shows that that's not necessarily the case, right? Ontario is an incredibly diverse place. And yet, a populist can have very large support among minority communities. So the idea that populism is somehow synonymous with this sort of white identity politics, and that it's impossible for populists to expand the base beyond that, I think is naive.
I think that's the unique thing about Doug Ford and even his brother Rob, that they have high support for a nation among visible minorities. So it sounds like you're saying maybe Doug Ford is just an itch Ontario needs to scratch, or does that sort of heralding a new political world order?
I don't know that I said that. I mean, I think it tried to scratch that itch with Rob Ford, didn't it? It's very tempting to make some kind of drug metaphor here, but I'll leave that. No, I don't think that these itches get scratched. I think that's the point. I think there's a hope that people have that, So look, there's the model of populism where populism is sort of this self-correcting mechanism, right? There's big flaws in our politics. Establishment parties are unresponsive enough. People feel disempowered by our politics. Nobody listens to what they really want. A bunch of that is true. And so populists are going to correct the mechanism, right? Because what they're going to do is that they push establishment parties to finally get their act together. To some degree, they themselves can actually make some real reforms. That means that the system delivers for people again, and things sort of calm down, and we return to a sort of normal politics. That's the optimistic vision. I think that often it's the opposite. It's a self-radicalizing mechanism, where populists don't help to address some of the underlying grievances, they often exacerbate them. Has Donald Trump helped to make people in the Midwest feel less like they're being screwed over by the political system? Feel more like they actually have economic hope? I don't think so. I don't think his policies do that, right? And second, it makes it much harder for establishment parties to actually do good work and to actually implement real policy reform that can deliver for people. So my fear is that it's self-radicalizing. And that when people one day come to recognize, hey, perhaps this particular populist actually lied to me and he wasn't very reliable and we should turn on him, they don't say, let's return to a more sort of moderate part of politics. They might say, let's go for somebody who's even more extreme. Or let's go for somebody who's a little bit like that guy, but just, doesn't turn out to be a crook. The guy over there seems honest,
I'm also curious about populism on the left side of the political spectrum. I feel like we tend to talk about it in terms of right-leaning, conservative politics, but I think someone like Bernie Sanders might be considered a lefty populist of sorts. Do you think that movement has as much momentum as maybe conservative populism?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it does have a lot of momentum in certain parts of the world. So in Latin America, traditionally, a certain form of left-wing populism has been powerful. Think of Venezuela. In parts of Southern Europe as well. But in the end, it strikes me that in most contexts, right-wing populism is going to win against left-wing populism. It's one of the things that makes me skeptical of left-wing populism. I don't understand what it is about the human psyche that makes it harder to blame a corporation or a billionaire than it is to blame that guy over there who doesn't look like you. But whenever these two things have come up against each other, that guy doesn't look like you has turned out to have more emotional appeal in most contexts. But more broadly, I think the question is, is there something positive about left-wing populism, or is it always dangerous? Well, I think it depends a little bit on what you mean by populism. It's not clear to me that in the way that I've described populism earlier, Bernie Sanders is a populist, right? So there's sometimes a temptation to call anybody who has left-wing economic policies populist. And I think that there can be people who have left-wing economic policies and say that a bunch of things have to change, but who recognize, for example, that people who disagree with them are legitimate. What certainly does exist is a set of left-wing populists who don't accept that. And Hugo Chavez in Venezuela is a terrifying example, right? He said Venezuela is rigged by political elites and by financial elites, by oligarchs. And that was true. He said we need to do much more for Venezuelan poor people. That was true too. But because he married those two things with a claim that anybody who disagrees with him is illegitimate, and that only people who are Chavistas are true Venezuelans, he ended up becoming incredibly politically repressive and turning a functioning democracy, if an imperfect one, into one of the most terrifying dictatorships we see in the world today, and one of the ones that have had the worst economic performance. Mm-hmm. So I think as soon as you start people saying, it's actually pretty simple, the only problem is the elites, and what we need to do now is just to push all these people who you don't agree with aside, to get rid of some of these institutional roadblocks which make it more difficult for me to really go and deliver for you. Just trust me, I'm going to fix it. That's always dangerous. And that can appear on the left as much as on the right.
So I think we're running out of time before a quick Q&A, but how do we save democracy? I'll save that question for the end.
So I only have 30 seconds to answer the question. Right? Okay.
In 100 words or less.
Sure, in 100 words or less. I think there's three big buckets of what we need to do, and they come out of the things I've talked about, right? To understand how you can save our democracy, you have to understand what's driving some of the dangers to it, right? Now look, we've got to win some elections, right? But we have to also fix some of the things that have made people angry in the first place. So the first thing is around the economy. I'm sometimes asked whether we shouldn't just abolish capitalism. Isn't the right answer just to get rid of capitalism because that's doing all these terrible things? There's never been a democracy in a country that hasn't been capitalist. And by the way, if you're on the political right, you might say, I only care about coal workers in the west of Canada who might lose their job, and I don't care about anything else. If you're on the political left, you should celebrate the fact that 2 billion people around the world have been lifted out of poverty over the past 20, 25 years. People who didn't have anything to eat, who didn't have electricity, who didn't have access to education, who now lead middle-class lives. That is an achievement of capitalism and of free trade and of globalization. But we need to fight much, much harder to make sure that ordinary people actually get the fruits of that. And not just within developed countries, the top 1%. And we can do that with policies that aren't necessarily deeply ideological. The first thing we have to do is to make sure that rich individuals and corporations actually pay the taxes they owe. And we don't do nearly enough for that. That's actually possible if we hired more people to look after them, if we were more willing to pay for information about the money they hide, and if we were more willing to lock some of them up if they've cheated on their taxes. The second thing is to actually increase productivity, to make sure that we have much bigger investments in education and so on than we do, including lifelong education. There's not just, if you've lost your job, here's a little retraining program, but ways for all of us to keep actually learning and so on. And the third thing is that, look, at the moment, if you're in Toronto, right, you're 28, 30, you have a pretty good job, you make a decent salary, you probably have a less good life in certain ways than your parents or grandparents did, because housing has become so much more expensive. Because you have to pay such a huge share of your salary in order to have somewhere decent to live. And that's something where we actually just need to build a lot more housing and get out of a weird addiction to trying to raise house prices. If a politician stood up for election, say for Premier of Ontario, and said, I'm going to make sure that the price of bread and butter is going to be as high as possible. Excuse me? But if they say, I'm going to make sure that your house price doesn't go down, people vote for it. Right? So we need to make sure that we actually try to make housing more affordable. So there's a whole bunch of economic measures which cumulatively allow people to do what the Brexiteers promised in the United Kingdom, take back control. Take back control in the sense that I will feel that I have control over my life, and I feel that my nation is not against globalization, it's not against free trade, but it can stand up for itself in the global economy. There's ways that the nation state can do that without having to leave the European Union, without having to give up on free trade. That's one thing. The second thing is around, and I know I'm way over 30 seconds, the second thing is about identity. We have to fight for an equal multi-ethnic society. But I think that means embracing nationalism. I grew up as a Jew in Germany, and so it comes very naturally to me to say perhaps we should just leave nationalism behind in the 20th century, but it's so cruelly shaped. I know, my family knows the dangers of nationalism pretty well. But what we've seen over the last 20, 25 years is that nationalism is not going away as a political force. And so I think it's a sort of half-domesticated animal. If you leave it to its own devices, the worst kinds of people are going to come in. In the United States, they tend to be called Steve, like Steve Bannon and Steve Miller and so on. And they'll prod and they'll bait the nationalist beat until it runs wild, until it's the worst form of itself it can be. So if people who don't like that either say, let's just get rid of nationalism, or they say, let's celebrate every subnational identity groups, whether they're ethnic, whether they're religious, whether they're sexual and so on, but not the national identity group, I think that we don't have anything to put in the place of what the Steves want to offer. So what we need to do is to defend minority groups against discrimination without footnote, without compromise, and proudly. I also think we need to emphasize what unites rather than what divides us across racial and ethnic and sexual and so on lines, right? And that means fighting for an inclusive nationalism in which, yeah, we're proud to be Canadian or American or German or whatever it may be, but we're going to make damn sure that everybody who lives in this country is included under that. The third thing is how to deal with social media and how to deal more broadly with the disenchantment that people feel. And one temptation there is to censor, is to say, let's just regulate what happens on social media. And there's certainly some laws that we need, and some laws that already exist that we need to enforce more clearly, like we saw with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. But I don't think censorship is the way to go. The internet is so freewheeling that it's incredibly difficult to actually stop certain kinds of content from being offered without being very heavy-handed in really restricting people's liberty. It allows populists to present themselves as martyrs who are being shut up and become all more popular as a result. And so I think instead of trying to limit the supply of noxious ideas, we have to limit the demand for it. And that means taking seriously fighting for our values. And taking seriously that, yes, there's lots of things that are wrong in our countries, and we need to be upfront about that. We need to fight to overcome those injustices. But there's also some things that are right. And you know what? It is better to be a citizen of Canada or the United States or of Germany than it is to be a subject of the dictators in Turkey or Russia or China. And we should point that out proudly. From Plato to Aristotle and from Machiavelli to Rousseau, any historical thinker who's thought about how to sustain a self-governing republic has emphasized the importance of passing our political values down from one generation to the next. But we've only paid lip service to that in the last decades because we thought democracy was safe. So we're not taking civics seriously in schools. In universities, we gripe about our political system, but we never explain to students, and I know that full well teaching at Harvard, we never explain to our students what it is in our political system that's worth saving. So I think we should change that, and each of us can actually play a big role in that.
You sound hopeful.
Sorry?
You sound hopeful.
I am hopeful.